He threw my keys off the penthouse balcony at 2 in the morning. Not my apartment keys. My car keys. The car he had already sold 3 days earlier without telling me, to cover the catering bill for a party I had not been invited to. I stood on the balcony in my pajamas while he told me to get out. My brother Derek had 14 guests still inside. I could hear them through the glass doors. Music, laughter, the specific warmth of a gathering from which I had always been adjacent rather than included. He pointed at the elevator. I picked up my bag from the hallway floor. I did not say anything. I pressed the button and I waited, and the doors closed between us. I need to tell you about the warehouse before I tell you what I found inside it. Derek had mentioned it exactly twice in the 5 years since our parents died. The first time was when the estate attorney listed it among the family assets, and Derek said, "That one's worthless, just a building," and moved the conversation forward before anyone could ask a follow-up question. The second time was when I asked during a particularly difficult month when I was trying to understand what the family actually owned, whether we should look into selling it or developing it. Derek said it was a liability, full of old junk, not worth the effort. Then he changed the subject. He had not been inside it. I understood this later. But on the night he directed me toward the elevator with 14 people in the next room and my car already gone, the warehouse was the only option I had. Derek had mentioned the address once, a commercial district on the eastern side of the city, and I had written it in a notebook years ago when I was trying to map the full picture of what our parents had left us. The notebook was in my bag, which I had grabbed from the hallway floor. My name is Andrea. I am 29 years old. I have a degree in logistics and supply chain management, and I have spent the last 4 years applying it not to a career, but to the management of my brother's increasingly complicated life, which had been the condition of my remaining in the penthouse and maintaining access to the small monthly allowance Derek controlled and which represented my only income. I had been meant to use the degree to build something. Instead, I had used it to organize Derek's shipments, track his property expenses, manage his vendor relationships, and absorb the administrative chaos of a man who was very good at acquiring things and very bad at maintaining them. I had paid the warehouse utility bills for 3 years. I knew this because I managed the payments from the family account, which Derek had given me limited access to for administrative purposes. The utility bills for the warehouse arrived quarterly, and I processed them without examining them closely, because there were always a dozen administrative tasks requiring attention simultaneously, and a utility bill for an empty building was the least interesting item on any given list. I thought about those bills on the taxi ride across the city. The address in my notebook matched a low building on a block of light industrial properties. Gray facade, roll-up metal door, or 2 standard windows covered from the inside. I had the key on my personal key ring because I had obtained a copy 2 years earlier for administrative purposes, and Derek had never asked for it back, possibly because he had never thought about it. I let myself in at 3:15 in the morning. The space was large and empty in the way warehouses are empty. High ceilings, concrete floors, the particular quality of air in a space that has not been recently occupied. There was a folding table near the entrance and a circuit breaker panel on the far wall. I found a sleeping bag in a storage closet that had probably been there for years, along with a camping lantern with functioning batteries. I was grateful for both. I slept on the concrete floor of my family's warehouse with my bag as a pillow, and I did not feel sorry for myself, which surprised me when I noticed it the following morning. What I felt was the specific and unfamiliar quality of a space that was empty of Derek. No instructions, no requests, no management tasks requiring my immediate attention. Just concrete and gray morning light and the sound of the city outside beginning its day. I made a list. It was what I did when a situation required organization and the situation had no existing structure. I wrote down what I had: cash in my wallet, the contents of my bag, the key, the clothes I was wearing, my laptop, my phone with 2 days of battery and a charging cable. I wrote down what I needed: food, a way to shower, a plan that extended past the next 48 hours. I wrote down what I knew. The building was legally Derek's, but its contents, if any, I had not been specifically itemized in the estate documentation. That last line I underlined. Then I started examining the building with the methodical attention of someone who had spent 4 years tracking assets and had learned that the difference between an overlooked thing and a valuable thing was usually just whether anyone had looked carefully enough. The first unusual thing I noticed was the electricity. The circuit breaker panel was labeled in the standard way: lighting, outlets, HVAC. But there was a fourth circuit I had not expected. It was labeled C storage and it was active. Not standby active. Running active. Drawing current continuously in a building that was supposed to be empty. I followed the circuit's position on the panel to the back wall. Part 2. The back wall looked like the rest of the building. Concrete block, painted gray at some point in the building's history, slightly darker than the other walls from age and the particular way paint weathers in a space that isn't regularly ventilated. I walked its length twice before I noticed the seam. Not a crack. A seam. The specific straight line that appears when two surfaces meet with deliberate precision rather than settling against each other over time. It ran floor to ceiling on the left side and along the top where the wall met the ceiling and along a horizontal line at approximately waist height. I pressed my hand flat against the surface. It was warmer than the surrounding wall. I spent 20 minutes finding the release. It was not dramatic. A recessed panel at shoulder height on the right side that required pressure at a specific angle, in the kind of mechanism designed to be unobtrusive rather than impenetrable. When it released, the false wall swung inward on a pneumatic hinge with the smooth, well-maintained movement of something that had been opened periodically and serviced with care. The space behind it was climate-controlled. I stood in the doorway and I looked at what was inside, and I did not move for a long time. 12 cars, arranged in 2 rows of 6, covered with fitted fabric covers, each one on a low platform with the specific positioning of objects that have been placed with intentionality, rather than stored with convenience. The air had the particular quality of a controlled environment: cool, dry, the faint smell of machinery, and something that might have been leather. Track lighting on a separate circuit illuminated the space in a warm, even way that was designed for display rather than function. I walked to the nearest car and I lifted the cover's edge. I do not know cars in the specific and detailed way that people who love them know cars. But I know research, and I know documentation, and I had spent 4 years managing assets for a man who acquired things, and I understood, standing in that room, that I was looking at objects that had been acquired by someone who knew exactly what they were worth. The lines of the car beneath the cover were specific and considered. I replaced the cover carefully, and I walked the length of the room, and I looked at each covered form, and I took photographs on my phone with the methodical thoroughness of someone who is building a record. Then I went back to my folding table and I opened my laptop and I began. I had the photographs. I had the dimensions of the cars I had measured roughly. I had the climate control system's brand name, which I photographed on the unit mounted to the far wall. I had 4 hours before the neighborhood became active enough to require me to think about other things, and I used them with the specific focus of someone who has identified a problem worth solving. By noon, I had a list. The cars had not been documented publicly anywhere I could access, but car dimensions, distinctive details, the particular configurations visible at the edges of the covers. These were things that matched to production records and auction histories and collector databases that were publicly accessible if you knew how to search them. I was good at searching. I had spent 4 years tracking provenance on Derek's acquisitions, and I applied the same methodology now with the same precision. 3 of the covers I could partially identify from visible details alone. One had a front grille configuration and hood lines that matched a specific 1968 model. One had wheel well proportions and a roofline visible from the back edge of the cover that corresponded to a Ferrari produced in a single model year for a film. One had a distinctive rear quarter panel shape that I had found in 3 separate collector databases by late afternoon. I called a number I found in a specialist directory at 5 in the evening. The man who answered was named Gerald Foss, and he had 30 years of experience in automotive appraisal with a specific focus on film and television vehicles. I said I had found a collection in a storage facility and needed a confidential assessment. I said I would send photographs. He said he would review them within 24 hours. He called back in 3 hours. He said, "Where did you find these?" He said it with the specific energy of a man who has just seen something that doesn't happen often. He said, "Do you understand what you're looking at?" I said, "I'm beginning to." He said the collection, based on the photographs alone, represented a minimum conservative valuation of $15 million. He said some of the individual vehicles, properly authenticated and brought to the right market, could exceed that estimate significantly. He said, "The bullet car alone, if it's what I think it is, changes the number considerably." I wrote the figure on my notepad. I looked at it for a moment. Then I called my former estate attorney, a woman named Christine Park, who had handled my parents' estate filing and who I had maintained a professional relationship with, because Christine was precise and reliable, and I had learned to keep precise and reliable people in my contact list. I asked Christine what it would take to legally transfer the contents of a building from one party to another. She said, "That depends on how the contents are documented in any existing ownership structure." I said, "What if the contents had never been specifically documented?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me more." Christine asked me 3 clarifying questions before she said anything else. The first was whether the contents of the building had been listed as specific items in the estate documentation following my parents' death. I told her they had not. The warehouse had been listed as a property asset. The building and the land, valued at its square footage in the commercial district, assessed at a figure that reflected the building's deteriorated exterior and its classification as unimproved industrial space. No inventory of contents had been conducted because Derek had told the estate attorney the building was empty. The second question was whether the cars could be traced to my parents' ownership through any documentation I had access to. I told her I had spent the previous day examining every file I could access from the family's administrative records, which I had maintained for 4 years and which were stored on a shared drive Derek had never bothered to examine closely. There were 4 entries: purchase records, insurance documents that had lapsed, and 2 maintenance logs, all connected to my father's name and all predating the estate filing by between 6 and 11 years. The third question was whether Derek had signed anything recently that pertained to the warehouse. I said, "Not yet, but I think he will." Christine said, "Explain what you mean." I told her what I had in mind. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "That would work if the document is properly structured and if he signs it without understanding its scope." She said, "I want to be clear that this is legal. It is not fraud. It is a transfer of property rights to assets that were never formally included in the estate distribution and which have been in your family longer than the estate filing." She said, "But you need to move carefully." I said, "I know how to move carefully." I had been moving carefully for 4 years. The document Christine drafted was a standard contents transfer agreement. Simple language. The kind of thing that appears in estate cleanups and property sales and commercial handoffs with sufficient frequency that it reads, to someone not examining it closely, as administrative paperwork. The operative clause stated that the signatory transferred all rights, claims, and ownership interests in any and all contents present within the warehouse at the listed address to the named recipient, effective upon signature. The named recipient was me. I needed Derek to sign it without asking why. This required understanding how Derek processed administrative requests, which I understood with the specific precision of someone who had been processing them on his behalf for 4 years. Derek did not read documents. He skimmed them for the parts that required his action and ignored the rest. He signed things when they were presented as necessary, routine, and already handled, when the framing communicated that the work had been done and his signature was the final formality rather than the substantive decision. I called him on a Wednesday morning. I had been in the warehouse for 11 days. I had not contacted him since the night he directed me toward the elevator. He answered on the 3rd ring with the tone of someone who had not expected to hear from me and was mildly annoyed at the interruption. I said, "I need to deal with the warehouse." I said I was going to have the remaining contents cleared out. I said there were some old items from when Dad used the building that needed to be properly disposed of, and that the clearing company required a contents transfer document for liability purposes. I said the word liability. Derek responded to liability the way he responded to all administrative language, as something that required resolution so it would stop requiring his attention. He said, "Just send it over." I said, "I'll bring it by this afternoon. It just needs your signature." He said, "Fine." I drove to the penthouse with Christine's document in a folder with two other administrative items I had legitimately needed him to sign: a routine property tax correspondence and a vendor payment authorization. I placed the three documents on the kitchen counter in the order that put the contents transfer in the middle, between the two items he understood and expected. I explained the first document. I explained the third. I said the middle one was the warehouse cleanup authorization, and he initialed it without looking down. I collected the folder. I said, "Thank you. I'll have the clearance done by Friday." He was already looking at his phone. I drove back to the warehouse. As Gerald Foss had arranged a transport company through his network, specialists in vehicle collection handling who understood the requirements of climate-controlled transport for high-value assets and who worked with the specific discretion that the situation required. They arrived Thursday morning with 3 enclosed transport trucks and a team of 6 who moved through the climate-controlled room with the professional efficiency of people who had handled significant collections before and knew how to do it correctly. By Thursday evening, the room was empty. The cars were in a secure facility under Gerald's custodianship, pending formal authentication and valuation. I locked the false wall and I locked the warehouse door and I drove away. Derek called me the following Monday. He said a developer had made an offer on the warehouse land and he was going to take it. He said the building was worthless and the offer was modest but acceptable. He said, "I don't suppose you want anything from the building before I finalize." He said it with the tone of someone extending a courtesy he was certain would be declined. I said, "I think I've already taken everything I need." He said, "What does that mean?" I said, "Just that I think we're settled on the warehouse. Good luck with the sale." He said, "Right." And he moved on to something else. I sat in the parking lot of a diner 2 blocks from the warehouse and I looked at the building through my windshield, and I felt something I had not felt in 4 years. Not triumph. Not the specific satisfaction of a plan executed correctly, though that was present too. Something quieter. The feeling of a weight lifted not by someone else's action but by your own, planned and executed over 11 days in a building your brother had called worthless. The building had not been worthless. Neither had the person he had sent to live in it. Part 4. The authentication took 6 weeks. Gerald worked through his network of specialists: automotive historians, film archive researchers, provenance documenters with access to studio records and production logs, and the specific institutional memory of people who had spent decades tracking where significant vehicles had gone after the cameras stopped rolling. Each car was examined, photographed, cross-referenced, and assigned a provenance report. The process was methodical and thorough and produced, at the end of the 6 weeks, a complete documentation package that confirmed what Gerald had suspected from the first photographs. 12 vehicles, all authenticated. Combined valuation at current market, $19.4 million. I read the report at the kitchen table of the studio apartment I had rented in the 3rd week after leaving the warehouse, paid for with the last of my personal savings and the proceeds from selling my laptop and replacing it with a cheaper model. The apartment was small and the table was pressed against the wall and the light in the mornings came through a single east-facing window, and I found all of it entirely adequate. I had been building a plan since the Thursday evening the transport trucks drove away. Christine had established a holding company in my name during the weeks the authentication was in progress. The company's purpose was straightforward: to manage, liquidate, and reinvest the proceeds from the vehicle collection in a manner that protected the assets from any potential claim and positioned them correctly for the tax and legal implications of a significant sudden asset discovery. Christine had been thorough. The documentation trail connecting the vehicles to my parents' ownership and through the contents transfer agreement to me was complete and unambiguous. Gerald brought the collection to a private auction in the 8th week. He had contacts in the collector community that extended across 3 continents, and he had spent the 6 weeks of authentication quietly alerting the relevant parties that a significant collection would be available. The auction was by invitation only. It conducted over 2 days at a facility Gerald used regularly, with bidders who arrived having already reviewed the provenance documentation and were prepared to move quickly on items of specific interest. I did not attend. Gerald represented the collection on my behalf and called me at the end of each session with results that I wrote down on the notepad I had been keeping since the first night in the warehouse. The final total, after Gerald's commission and the associated fees, was $18.2 million, transferred to the holding company's account in 2 tranches over the following 3 weeks. I sat with that figure in the way I had learned to sit with significant information, without rushing to act on it, allowing it to become real through the ordinary passage of time rather than through immediate response. Derek discovered what had happened in the 10th week. Not from me. From the auction coverage, a collector publication had run a brief item on the sale of a significant film vehicle collection, noting that several landmark cars had achieved record prices. The article mentioned the Bullitt Mustang by name. Derek called me 40 minutes after the publication posted the item online. I know this because I saw the timestamp on the missed call notification. I did not answer. He left a voicemail. The voicemail was 4 minutes and 20 seconds long, and I listened to it once while standing in my apartment kitchen with my coffee going cold. It moved through several stages: confusion, then calculation, then the arrival at the correct conclusion, and then something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but occupied the space between them where a person lives when they understand they have given something away, without knowing its value. He mentioned the document. He said the word signed. He said, "You knew." He said it repeatedly in different configurations, as though repetition would produce an explanation that served him better than the accurate one. I deleted the voicemail. I did not call him back. Christine confirmed that the contents transfer agreement was fully executed, legally binding, and that the subsequent sale of the warehouse land, completed the week before by Derek for a modest sum, had no bearing on the contents that had already been legally transferred. She said, "There is no claim available to him." She said it with the professional brevity of someone who has reviewed the documentation thoroughly and found it exactly as solid as she had designed it to be. I said, "I know. Thank you." She said, "What are you going to do next?" I had been thinking about that question since the first morning in the warehouse when I made my list and underlined the line about contents that had not been specifically itemized. I had been thinking about it through the authentication and the auction, and the 2 tranches and the cold coffee and the missed call and the deleted voicemail. I said, "I'm going to build a company." The logistics consultancy opened 6 months after the warehouse. I had spent 22 years preparing for it without knowing that was what I was doing. See, 4 years managing Derek's administrative operations had given me a complete operational education in what logistics looked like when it was done badly and under pressure, which turned out to be exactly the knowledge that made me useful to the small and mid-sized businesses that became my first clients. I understood disorganization from the inside. I knew how to find the structural failure beneath the surface problem and address the structure rather than the symptom. The first year was modest. The second year was not. Derek called twice more in the months after the voicemail. I did not answer either call. He did not leave messages after the first one. The absence of messages told me he had consulted an attorney and been given the same answer Christine had given me. There was no claim available. He had signed a document transferring all contents of the warehouse to me and had then sold the building itself for a figure that bore no relationship to what had been inside it, because he had not known what was inside it because he had never once gone to look. He had called it worthless. He had been entirely wrong about that. My parents had acquired the collection over a decade before their deaths. Auction purchases, private sales, each car documented in records that had been sitting in the shared administrative drive for years, while Derek managed the family assets without examining them. My father had known what he had. He had stored it carefully in a climate-controlled space with track lighting and pneumatic hinges and a separate circuit breaker, in a building he had called a utility warehouse to anyone who asked. He had not told Derek. I did not know why and had no way to know why, but I had a theory that had nothing to do with Derek, and everything to do with a man who had built something quietly and had wanted it to remain quiet until the right moment. The right moment had arrived in the form of an eviction at 2 in the morning and an address in a notebook and a utility bill with an unexplained current draw. Christine came to the company's first anniversary gathering. She stood near the window of the event space I had rented, and she looked around at the 23 employees I had hired and the clients who had come, and the room that had the specific warmth of people who were there because they wanted to be, and she said, "You built this fast." I said, "I had good preparation." She said, "How is Derek?" I said, "I genuinely don't know." She accepted that and moved on to the food, which was good because I had spent considerable attention on the food. I had moved into an apartment I owned in the spring of the company's second year. Not extravagant, specific. A place I had chosen for every feature independently. The light, the layout, the kitchen counter space, the view from the second bedroom that I used as a home office. I had furnished it slowly over several months with things I had chosen without consulting anyone or managing anyone else's preferences. Each piece had been considered and deliberate and was mine in the complete sense of the word. I had a car. I want to mention this plainly because my brother had sold my last one to pay a catering bill and had thrown the keys off a balcony at 2 in the morning and had directed me toward an elevator with 14 people in the next room and music playing through the glass doors. The car I owned now was reliable and well-maintained, and the title was in my name and had been since the day I signed the purchase agreement, which I had read in full before signing it. I drove it on a Saturday morning to the commercial district on the eastern side of the city. The warehouse block had been redeveloped. The building was gone. A small mixed-use development had replaced it, ground floor retail and 4 floors of residential above, the kind of project that appeared in every recovering commercial district across every mid-sized city in the country. It looked entirely unremarkable. I sat in the car across the street for a few minutes. I thought about a concrete floor and a camping lantern with functioning batteries and a circuit breaker labeled C storage running current in a building that was supposed to be empty. I thought about a seam in a gray-painted wall that was warmer than the surrounding surface. I thought about 12 covered cars in a climate-controlled room and Gerald's voice on the phone saying, "Do you understand what you're looking at?" I had understood. Eventually, which was all that had been required. I started the car. I drove to my office. There was work to do, and it was good work, and it was mine in the complete and unambiguous sense that nothing in my life had been mine for the 4 years before a morning in a warehouse when I made a list and underlined the things I needed to look at more carefully. I had looked carefully. That had been enough. That had been, from the beginning, exactly enough.